What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my dream CRPGs. The CRPGs I hope to see made one day, even if it is extremely unlikely, which is probably the best place to start. I would consider most of the CRPGs on this list to have little to no chance of actually being made, if I'm being honest, and I have intentionally left off ones that I think are more likely. For instance, I think it's pretty plausible that at some point Larian Studios will make another Divinity CRPG, and thus I didn't feel the need to include it. I also didn't want to include things where the franchise that it's set in has clearly moved on, as I would love to see another CRPG variant of games like Fallout or Pillars of Eternity, but I simply don't expect it to happen. Nonetheless, though, chances are you probably know that I cover CRPGs pretty extensively, and this is a question that I get all the time. Basically just what I would love to see in terms of CRPGs, and while I've talked about sequels more generally and the like, I've never broached this particular subject, so I thought it would be fun to do that today. So with that in mind, let's jump right into it. Now, first up on the list, and truth be told, the one I would want to see the most, is a Vampire the Masquerade CRPG specifically made by Owlcat Games. And while very generally I love the games that Owlcat Games makes, there is actually a specific reason I want this game from them. And that's because Vampire the Masquerade is really at its core about all the drama and intercourt politics between different types and clans of vampire, and often there's a sort of underlying tone of everyone's using you and no one's telling you the truth. And the reason I think Owlcat could do this really well in terms of a CRPG is because of the way they've implemented their secret endings into Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous, as both of those games see you both gathering up a bunch of information and then applying it properly in order to achieve a secret ending. It tends to be very convoluted and requires a whole bunch of information gathering on the part of you, the player, and I think something like that could be applied perfectly to Vampire the Masquerade in an effort to actually see through the schemes of all of the vampires involved and the people undoubtedly using you in order to further their own aims. And I think as a plot device, especially in a game that would inherently be filled with all sorts of choice and consequence, they could probably knock that out of the park. And given that honestly there just aren't a lot of great games in the Vampire the Masquerade universe, that would certainly be fantastic as well. So as much as I hope Bloodlines 2 is great, this is the game I would truly love to see in that franchise. Which brings us to our second entry, one I've talked about on the channel before, and this is Arcanum 2, which is an interesting one because if you've watched Tim Kane's YouTube channel at all, one of the founding members of Troika Games, he has discussed at length about the ideas that they had kicked around for Arcanum 2, and how it would involve a sort of resource war under the surface to further the plot about magic and technology being at odds. And honestly, just that sounds really cool, but even if they scrapped that and did something else entirely, I think it would be fantastic, because the world of Arcanum is truly unique. And while there is a lot of rough edges for the original game, there's a ton of love for that game in particular, and I would really enjoy seeing them do something with that IP, because for a long time, an Arcanum sequel was literally pretty much impossible because Activision owned the IP and they weren't doing anything with it, but since Microsoft has acquired them, and the fact that Microsoft also owns the studios that some of the main people behind Arcanum also now work at, you could theoretically make that happen. But I do acknowledge that it's extremely unlikely, mostly because all of those people are busy. For instance, I think Clockwork Revolution, coming from In Exile, is likely to be a spiritual successor in many ways to Arcanum specifically in terms of its industrial revolution meets magical sorts of things. So it looks like, at least to some degree, they're kind of already on the path to reimagining what Arcanum was all about into a different setting, and that's not to mention the other projects that the other members who worked on Arcanum are also on, so it would just be a whole lot of maneuvering for a game that, let's be honest, has a bit of a niche fan base, I would say, especially these days. So my hopes are not high, but I really would love to see that game, which is a very similar case for Tyranny 2. Now obviously I would want this from Obsidian as they made the original Tyranny, and Tyranny is a fantastic CRPG. My main gripe with it though is that right as the story starts to really ramp up and get interesting, the game ends, and you're left with this big plot hook that they just don't wind up doing anything with as your character comes into a whole lot of power, enough to rival the big bad. And that's to say nothing of the stellar world building and the impressive magic system that game utilized. So I would love to see a sequel tackle tackle basically what Tyranny 1 left off on. Now, the reason we're probably never going to see a sequel to this is that it's no secret that Tyranny did not perform especially well, which is also the case for Pillars of Eternity 2, and as a studio, quite frankly, I think they've simply moved on, which is fine. Not everything has to continue forever, but nonetheless, I was really impressed by what Tyranny did and was trying to do, and I think it had some fantastic ideas that it would be a real shame to let go to the wayside, but unfortunately I think that's likely what's going to happen. Which brings me to my fourth entry. Now this one is a slightly more amorphous idea, but it's basically a Lovecraftian CRPG, and while we've gotten close to kind of the things I'm after here, nothing has ever quite scratched that itch. For instance, we very recently, just this year, got Skald Against the Black Priory, which was a Lovecraftian retro RPG that I enjoyed a great deal, and I think Skald was definitely on the right track, but it had a relatively small scope, and what I'd really love to see is something that expands upon these ideas in particular, and allows them to explore more of the Cthulhu mythos if you prefer, but also being able to put their own spin on it these days. But I would love to see them dive into the more obscure elements of that universe, but also in a way that is more interactable. And this is the problem with this particular one, is simply that I would love a CRPG to do this in a way that unfortunately kind of goes against what Lovecraftian horror is all about, which is the unknown and the unknowable. And when you start bringing those into an RPG, quantifying and classifying them, it becomes difficult to maintain those elements, which is realistically why I think I'll be eternally let down by this one, but I do think Skald is the closest we've gotten to something to like what I had in mind here. But something involving the Necronomicon, Azathoth, and Nyarlathotep, and maybe they could even rope in Keziah Mason as they sort of weave a detailed plot surrounding the subversion of reality into chaos that you and a group of heroes would need to stop. But realistically, I think the biggest hurdle to something like that would just be the RPG systems involved, while also maintaining the spirit of the source material, which would not be an easy needle to thread, frankly. So unfortunately, I don't think it's ever going to happen, which means the idea will simply have to continue to be that amorphous blight of nethermost confusion which blasphemes and bubbles at the center of all infinity. Which brings me to my last entry, on a much lighter note. Now this one is tricky because there are games kind of like it that already exist, mainly in the vein of Shadowrun, but Shadowrun in particular tends to be a little bit limited in scope. But to be a little more specific, what I would love to see here is a Cyberpunk meets Magic sort of setting. Now, on one hand, Shadowrun in particular manages to blend, I would say, more modern times with the idea and concept of magic pretty well. The part that it has less so of is the cyberpunk elements. They're certainly there, don't get me wrong, but it's pretty mild in comparison to something that is like truly cyberpunk. Whereas what I'm talking about is something more akin to Cyberpunk 2077 in terms of tone and execution. However, instead of just, the magic of science and machinery, it being literal magic that actually powers some of this and led to those advancements in technology to allow for that kind of thing. Ultimately, I think the Shadowrun franchise is probably what would be the closest to this in terms of it ever realistically actually happening, and even then I don't think it's likely given that we've already got 3 of those games and no one really seems to be clamoring for more of them. But if they could take some of those general concepts and simply expand them and make them much larger in scope, then I think we'd be on to something. But the problem with that is that it might be necessary to change up the RPG systems, which is why the Shadowrun setting I don't think would work specifically. In particular, the Shadowrun series tends to be a little more mission-based than what I had in mind, which would be something a little more free roam and exploration-focused in the vein of some of its contemporary peers, which I think would allow them to explore the setting and the concepts of transhumanism a little more, which I think the concepts of both that extreme level of regular technology, but then having it fueled by magic to alter the human body even further could really lead to a lot of fun quests that really engage with the question of what it even means to be human in a world like that. Though the tricky part there is that there are a lot of games doing a similar thing, such as, again, Cyberpunk 2077, which has a lot of this minus the magic, and they're already working on a sequel for that one. So just that alone, then given the fact that CRPGs are a very niche market in comparison to most things most of the time, with BG3 being, I would say, the most anomalous influence there, I just don't see a project like that ever getting greenlit, but I suppose only time will tell, as has been the case with basically everything you've seen in this video up to this point. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this. I would love to hear your ideas and things you would enjoy in terms of CRPGs and the like, and while I think I might be familiar with a few things people might throw out there, I'm still very curious to hear what's on your mind on the subject. But with that in mind, that's where we're going to wrap it up. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.